Hi and welcome to Studio Marmalade. Today I'm going to be talking about a Swedish built amplifier, probably built in the 60s or possibly even 70s, even though it looks like an older, maybe 40s, 50s construction. The brand of this amp is called Amerikansk Ljudteknik AB, which directly translates into American Audio Technology Limited. Now this company, or whatever it actually was, I guess it was a company, there's not very much written about it, and if you're not from Sweden you probably never heard about it. I am from Sweden, I'm interested in guitar amps and audio electronics, but I'd never heard of this company. So I googled this name and found out that it was most likely the brand made up of two gentlemen who developed electronics for the movie theater business. They made movie theater speakers and amplifiers, and probably to increase the sales they used the same brand names as some of earlier American brands. So they just borrowed the names and built their own constructions and sold these just to movie theaters in Sweden in the 50s, 60s, something like that. So this company has a somewhat dubious history, you may say, and I don't think they were extremely successful either, to be honest. This particular amp is called GF10, and the GF may very well stand for gitarrförstärkare, which then is a guitar amplifier in Swedish. That is just my interpretation of it. I'm not sure if that's how it is, but it's called GF10. And the 10 may indicate that it's about 10 watts. It's not actually totally impossible. It may be around 10 watts. A friend of mine bought this. He had not seen or heard the amp much more than in the picture, but he bought it and hoped that it's actually a sort of Swedish-made Fender Champ-ish amplifier. So he handed it over to me right away when he got it to ask me have a look at it, because it's quite old. As I said, it's probably built in the 60s, 70s, something like that, and probably needs a little bit of checking up the capacitors and sort of like that. And of course I wasn't able to find a schematic of the amp, so I have drawn the schematic myself. And the circuit is quite simple. It's not exactly a Champ clone, but it's of course very Champ-like, because it's a 3-valve and 3-tube amplifier, a rectifier, a preamp tube, and a power amp tube. Now the preamp tube being ECC83 or 12AX7, that's very similar to basically any other amp. But the power tube is a 6L6, not the 6V6. This may very well, of course, be something that has been changed in the amp, because there are no specifications on the chassis or whatever what valves should be in the sockets. So I can just judge from what is actually in the amp at this very moment when I got it. But it may have been a construction with the 6L6, and that would also make sense if the GF10 would stand them for 10 watts. But this is just my speculation. The layout of this amp is quite simple. There are 2 inputs and 1 volume control. Now the inputs are labeled instrument or microphone, I can't remember, and the other one is labeled stereo. Now this is a bit amusing, because there's nothing stereo about this amp at all. The only reason I can think of is that the word stereo is commonly used in Sweden as a description of hi-fi equipment. And of course there's not very much hi-fi about this amp at all, but that's the only conclusion I can make. And the word stereo on the input also indicates that this is not a 4050s amp, because the stereo was not even sort of invented. So the word stereo became a popular word in the 60s, and that sort of indicates that this is an amp from the 60s. It's built in a wooden cabinet. Looks very nice actually, like an old radio or old speaker box in a nice wooden finish. And the front panel is red, actually very neat. And it's got this, I think 8-inch, maybe it's 6.5 or something like that, speaker. And the speaker is a Swedish made one. It's branded Svenska Högtalarfabriken, which translates into Swedish loudspeaker manufacturing company. I know this brand from another of my amps. I have a Hagström 26, a small travel amplifier with a Svenska Högtalarfabriken loudspeaker in it. And if the sound of my Högtalarfabriken equipped Hagström amp is anything to judge by, then this Amerikansk Ljudteknik amplifier will sound absolutely terrible. That is just judging the speaker, because all I've heard from the Svenska Högtalarfabriken brand actually sound quite terrible. But this may be the amp or the speaker that proved me wrong. Who knows? We'll see. Anyway, I will now put the amplifier on the workbench and connect it to the variac and see what happens. See if anything explodes or starts burning. Let's hope not. And see if there's any life in this amplifier. So, let's get to it. So here is the amplifier. As you can see, quite nice looking wooden cabinet with a plywood baffle and metal handle. On the back side I've taken away the metal cover. There's a metal net here covering the back side. Unscrewed that. I also unscrewed the screws for the chassis holding it to the cabinet. And inside here you can see the speaker. It looks like an 8-ohm speaker. The output transformer, and on the chassis the 3 tubes: the rectifier, preamp tube, and the power tube. And there are 3 fuses behind the rectifier as well. I actually skipped the fuses in the schematic, to be honest. There's a power transformer there, and there's actually even a voltage selector over here. So there are several primary windings on the power transformer. There are the inputs labeled microphone, and the one labeled stereo. And volume control, I guess it says ljudstyrka, which then is sound strength. It's an old saying in Swedish as well. It actually says also uteffekt, power of the amp, 8 watts. So it's not a 10 watt as I assumed. It's got a serial number 522. I highly doubt that they made 522 units of this one, but it's numbered 522. So it looks kind of nice actually. So I'm going to take the chassis out of the cabinet. There we go. And inside we can see a few capacitors. There's one mounted in the chassis. Well, very neat, very neat. But the capacitors are old indeed. There are 3 electrolytic capacitors here that I think would actually need changing, but we'll see. I will power it up and let's take it from there. This is the circuit diagram that I drew for this one. I think it's accurate, I'm not 100% sure. But there's a weird circuit connected to the loudspeaker. So there's a 300 ohm resistor parallel with a 25 microfarad capacitor to the ground, and on the other side of the speaker there's the negative feedback loop connected to the cathode of the 6L6. So it's very, very weird construction. I have never seen anything like this, but it may work. I have no idea. And this also means that I cannot use any other speaker easily, because then I need to connect these yellow and white wires from the speaker, which then go to two lugs on the output tube socket. But there are some limitations in what I actually can do here. So yeah, the power cable for this one is grounded. It's using this kind of connector. The only way I've ever seen this was on an ancient waffle iron that we had in my home when I was little. And when I say ancient, I guess that waffle iron was from the 60s or something like that. So it's quite unusual. I've never seen it in a guitar amplifier, but it's a earthed connector anyway. And luckily, we got the cable with the amp. So let's take down the Telecaster and connect this one to the Variac. So I will try to keep the downside of the chassis available. It's not 100% stable here, but it slides just a little bit until the transformer hits the magnet of the speaker here, so I think it should be safe. And I need to connect some voltmeter just to make sure what input voltage we have here. Okay, so let's give this a go. 12 volts, 33 volts, 52. There's actually no indicator light on this whatsoever, so there's no way of telling whether it's receiving power or not, but I can see it is. 91 volts, 116 volts, and the input voltage selector is set to 240. 138 volts. Now I have a very vague but still hum noise in the speaker, rising up to 147 volts, 154. And what I'm gonna do now is connect the other voltmeter here to measure the, yeah, that's what I said, the filament of this baby. And let's see, they should be, because measuring the filament voltage, easy way to determine whether the input voltage selector is set right or not. And I'm now at 164 volts from the Variac and 4.5 volts on the filaments, 194 volts input and 4.8 on the filaments, 210 volts input and 5.2 volts makes sense. Going up to 221 volts, 5.6 volt filament, and 230 reading 5.8 volts on the filaments. And actually this was the 240 setting, so I shall crank up the Variac to 240, and then I have 6.1 volts on the filament. And I can see the glow in the power tube, and I can see the glow in the rectified tube. There's a little bit of noise in the speaker, but it's not much at all. So let's see, let's connect the input signal to this one. I'm fitting it with a 1 kHz sine signal. Sine wave signal, yeah, and it's making the noise. There's some noise, some scratch noise. Coming from somewhere. Turning it off now because I am starting to wonder if that capacitor is sort of expanding. It is a good thing that I have the video of this, because I'm actually gonna have a look at that now, and just to make sure what this looked like when I started. It's also a good time for me to move the clips, because I don't need to measure the filament anymore. So I had a look at the video, and from what I could see, there was nothing that actually happened to this capacitor. It was probably this swollen already from the beginning. However, it doesn't look really good. It looks like it's about to come apart, and it's actually, there's a crack in the end of this one. Yeah, that's not a good thing, and it's actually coming apart. Yeah, this one needs replacing. There's no doubt about that. And since I did draw the schematic for this one, I can also tell that this is the this 25 microfarad 30 volts or 35 volts. I probably have something lying around that could fit in there. There's supposed to be 2 filter caps in the... It's a bit strange saying it's supposed to be, because I drew this, so I should know. The 8 and 32 is of course then the chassis mounted capacitor here. And there's supposed to be a 25 microfarad capacitor from the first cathode of the ECC83, and that must be that big black one back here, because that's also 25 microfarad. Makes sense. So that's 1, 2, and we have something over here. So what I was supposed to do was actually to change the input. See if there was a 230 volt setting. There's 220 there. 150, 127, 110. And then back to 240. So no, there's no 230. I'm gonna have to live with the 240 volts, but that's okay. Okay, so let's measure some tube voltages in this baby. To do that, let's change this, put it somewhere on the ground, and the ground connector is this big one through here. It's just connected so that it's not in the way for anything else. That might be good. I'm not very keen on that capacitor coming apart. I shall of course change that. There's a little bit of background noise here. I don't think you can also hear it, but there's something making noise in the speaker, and it's there all the time. So it's very difficult to say if there's any component affecting this sound or not. Anyway, I'm gonna do some measuring on the capacitors here. This one says 0.9 volts. 0.927 volts. Yeah, it could actually be correct. The cathode voltage could be 0.927 volts. There's the other cathode. They were 1.1 volt. Yeah, I think there's something wrong with the cathode bypass capacitor on the first half of the ECC83. Anyway, moving on. I wonder how I came to the conclusion of the value of this very capacitor over there. It's probably the 8 microfarad capacitor, and let's do some measuring of the plates. So the plates are on pin 1 and 6. It's actually a bit tricky measuring this one because there are wires going all around it. 103 volts, 130 volts. And the plate of the output tube. We're then talking about the pin 3. 1, 2, 3, here it is. We have 303 volts there. So there seems to be 104 volts and 130 volts on the plates of the preamp tube. So I have replaced the first of these two 25 microfarad capacitors, and just to give a little image of the leaps forward in technology, here's a comparison. Now indeed the original capacitor is a 25 microfarad 35 volts, and the one I replaced is 22 microfarads 25 volts. But I think you get the idea. Old one, new one. Now I'm gonna get rid of the second one in here because I can just assume that it's as worn as this one. It's by the brand Tesla, and it has been very properly soldered. And that's good, but I really need to get it out of here. I cannot seem to get this warm enough. Also, what I think I need to do is to change this brown capacitor over here. That is the 8 microfarad filter capacitor in the power section. Sorry, the power supply. And as the other capacitors were in quite poor condition, I think I may just as well replace this one as well. It's wrapped several rounds around this. Yeah. 400 volts, 8 microfarad. Now I'm not sure that I do have that actually. Now this is only a 250 volts, 10 microfarad capacitor. But since I did measure the voltages in this before, and the voltage here was about 160, if I remember it right, then this should be quite well good enough. Of course I will measure the voltage again before leaving it in permanently. Okay, so I'm putting the probe back. Actually, I'm going to clip the ground wire to the capacitor that we soldered in here before. Put this to voltage again. Connect this one. Turning it on. And measuring. Okay, it's 250 and rising. I'm turning it off. It's apparently too small for this. So I'm going to need to change this to a 300 volt capacitor. I'm not going to take any risk there. I just need to order a new capacitor for this. Okay, so then we're done for today. Thank you for watching this episode from Studio Marmalade. If you like what you've seen and heard, then please consider subscribing by clicking the bell, and you'll be notified next time I'll post anything about guitars, amplifiers or other sound related stuff. So till then, take care, bye.